So basically, once you start scrolling reels on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, the hours go by and you don't realize where all the time went, right? What do you like to share? What do you skip? All of that is being recorded for engagement. And based on this data, they can keep you hooked on the platform. And this is the whole model of these platforms to keep you hooked. And then going back to the Meta case, the commission felt that Meta, specifically Instagram, is not doing enough in order to curb addictive design, and they felt that children are still seeing negative content.
So the issue isn't really just teenagers being addicted to social media, but the issue is also how these algorithms are designed.
So if I'm into cat videos and I spend a longer time watching a cat video, I will receive more and more of cat videos and not more diverse content. So I will only, and this is very important for elections and politics, that you only see one viewpoint more and
Hmm.
more and not diverse viewpoints.
Infinite scrolling, banning teenagers from using social media, and the addiction of the news feed on all of our smartphones. This is something that governments around the world are trying to grapple with today. We've already spoken about the lawsuits that were filed in the United States against Meta and Google and other social media platforms on how they're basically fueling addiction of young people to social media. And now we're seeing how in the European Union, the EU is saying that Meta is engineering addiction through its algorithms and through its feeds. So, to talk about this, we're joined by Ramsha Jahangir, who's a deputy editor at the Tech Policy Press. She's been reporting for Dawn as well over the years on technology, so we're very happy to be joined by her. Thank you, Ramsha, for speaking with us. And perhaps we can start with talking about the architecture of compulsion that we see on social media, specifically on Meta, as this case relates to the EU trying to hold Meta accountable on its addictive algorithms and interface. So maybe you can talk a bit about what the issues are that the EU is seeing with the architecture of how Meta designs its platforms.
Thank you so much, Osama. It's always good to be back on Dawn, where all of this started. And obviously, we're talking about things, the case that is very specific to Europe, but the implications for this are actually global, because as we know, social media is global, and the way Facebook works, Instagram works, is the same for all users, but regulations are different around the world. So maybe I could actually start by talking about the way social media generally works. In this case, we're talking about meta platforms, so Instagram, Messenger, but generally TikTok has the same feed, where on Instagram we have Reels that we call infinite scroll. So basically, once you start scrolling Reels on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, the hours go by and you don't realize where all the time went, right? So this infinite scroll concept is exactly what the EU is trying to regulate, because they say that under EU law, which is the Digital Services Act, this will have negative effects on the protection of minors. So children will be exposed to more harmful content. Addiction is a big piece of this because, as I said, and this is not just for children, it's also for everybody. When we start scrolling, it's very easy to get addicted to that sort of design, and this is exactly what the EU is trying to change. So the well-being is an argument, addiction is an argument, and the way these recommender systems is what they're called. So it's easy to predict what your interests are. You must have noticed when you're scrolling on Instagram or any of these platforms, the more you watch something, you will receive very similar content. So if I'm interested in uh, watching cat videos, you will see that you will receive more and more cat videos over time. So this is exactly what the you know uh, platforms are doing when they use behavioral signals to see what gets most attention from you, how much time do you spend on specific content, what do you like to share, what do you skip. All of that is being recorded for engagement, and based on this data they can keep you hooked on the platform. And this is the whole model of these platforms, to keep you hooked.
No, thank you for explaining that so well. We've seen how now the European Union is moving to regulating the interface, right? So, why does the Digital Services Act treat addictive design as a systemic design risk rather than a matter of losing self-control by internet users?
So the Digital Services Act is a very comprehensive law. So it's not a content moderation law. It doesn't require specific pieces of content to be removed, but instead it requires platforms to do something called as risk assessments and audits. So risk assessments is a very technical term, but I'll try my best to explain it. So risk assessments are basically reports, specialized reports, where big tech companies can assess risks to people and users. So, for instance, what are the risks that would cause the most harm, and what can we do to reduce those harms? So, this assessment is basically required under the Digital Services Act. So, the law itself basically targets the design function. They want platforms to consider, would your platform be used to spread, for instance, election misinformation? Are children being exposed to unsafe content? Um, could your advertising model enable scams? And just this week, EU regulators also went after online marketplaces for selling illegal products. So there's a case against AliExpress. So it's a very comprehensive law, but essentially all platforms are required to do these risk assessments specific to the type of products and services they sell. And based on these reports, then the regulators, which is the European Commission, can then make a decision, are platforms doing enough to reduce harm or not? And then going back to the Meta case, the Commission felt that Meta, specifically Instagram, is not doing enough in order to curb addictive design. And they felt that children are still seeing negative content. They are still hooked on these platforms, which will not have good mental health effects on children, which is why now the Commission is asking Meta to reconsider how it evaluates those risks, reassess the way it approaches risk assessments, and detail in a better way and more convincing way what it's doing to ensure that children and users are not exposed to this content.
So, what we're seeing in this case and many others is that regulators are challenging the default settings of platforms, right? So what that does is like, they're trying to introduce optional screen time alerts, complex parental controls that already exist as argued by the platforms. But where basically what they're doing is placing the burden on users. That's what the platforms are doing. Whereas, as we already discussed, these regulations are targeting the overall systems that companies have. So, what does this mean for companies like Meta? So, if this was to go through, would there be mandatory product changes? Or, there is already regulatory oversight. And there's also fines up to 6% of the global turnover, which is a huge amount, right? So how do we see these platforms reacting to such regulatory measures?
That's a good question, Osama. I mean, obviously, platforms will not agree with these findings and they will push back and they will say we've taken all the steps possible. So, in response to the EU finding as well, Meta said that they rolled out teen accounts. So, teen accounts are specific for teenagers under, I think, 18 or 16. I'm not sure about the age. Basically children using teen accounts will not access harmful content. So they won't have access to functions like Instagram Live without parental approval. So Meta argues that they've rolled out teen accounts that automatically protects teens and puts parents in control. And it also allows them to block access to Instagram at night. And it can also allow them to cap daily screen time at just 15 minutes. So these interventions should be enough. But of course, the Commission has found that this is not enough. And I would also argue that you can already see that children are still being exposed to all sorts of things. And the Commission also says this in their press release, that children can easily bypass and pretend that their parents to use these tools. And so Meta is not doing enough. And in the law itself, generally, it recommends, like I said, it's not a content removal law. So it recommends changing recommendation systems, increasing content moderation capacity, improving transparency.
Yes, Ramsha. So the issue isn't really just teenagers being addicted to social media, but the issue is also how these algorithms are designed. And yes, they're getting everyone addicted with the purpose of trying to extract as much data as possible, right? Which then fuels the design of the platform moving on, and what we see on the feed. And then this relates also to issues around data protection, right? Because essentially, what these platforms are doing is collecting and harvesting data on each user and using that to selling that to advertisers, and then advertisers also using that, but also for the company to then keep recommending different relevant material to each user. So the question that arises is that can Meta de-optimize engagement, right? Because this engagement and addiction is so built into the product design, that it would be hard for the company to agree to that, because that would lead to, presumably fewer lesser profits. So if they disable autoplay, if they disable infinite scroll by default, session lengths would obviously reduce, content discovery will get impacted, and of course, the advertising inventory and revenue would also be affected. So, how could Meta recalibrate ranking objectives? Keeping in mind all of this, where watch time and well-being resources are introduced, and other signals are also given. What would this do to the product design and business model of social media?
Another question, and this is why I said this case has global significance, because this is not just about Europe, it's the social media products are global, and we all are accessing the same design by default. So this is why it's not just about platforms proving that they are safe, but if the commission goes ahead and Meta is not able to convince the regulators that they're doing enough, this will change social media entirely for everybody using it, because this is just, as you pointed out, how platforms work. Um, I would say that we will find out. I mean, this is a very long. It's EU. It's known for its regulation. This is just a preliminary finding. It's not a fine yet. If the commission is not satisfied, a few months down the lane, you can see 6% of Meta's global turnover. They will introduce a fine based on that, which is debatable for a company the size and scale of Meta. It's not a lot, but in terms of the changes that the commission is asking for, it can be very, very significant. It's also not just about Meta. So the commission has also a similar proceeding going on against TikTok. And there also they've said the same thing, that there is addictive design, there is infinite scroll, and you need to introduce design changes. So it's also a question of how different platforms approach the commission. TikTok's, for instance, has generally been more forthcoming. So if one platform implements something, obviously that also has significance for the other platform. So we will see what really happens. But the question really is that I don't think this is compatible. I don't think it's possible to go after the design changes at the same time that they keep the same business model. There will have to be some very significant changes from platforms to implement something of this nature. So I don't have an answer to how will this work in practice, but I would say that this is a case to keep a close eye on.
Right, and like you said, it could have an impact on how social media works. And you know, it's making me it's reminding me of how generally the media landscape has changed the world over, right? The
Yeah.
advertising model has changed, how media functions has changed, and such challenges could potentially then also push social media companies to change. And we've already seen so many layoffs this year and last year in these big tech companies, despite them recording huge profits. So it's interesting to observe what is happening, and of course, the companies are now heavily investing in artificial intelligence. So that's another push. Um, we'll get back a bit to the feed, but I'm also interested in how um, this move and others by the European Union is impacting the EU's relationship with the United States of America, where a lot of these companies are based. And what this is also doing is, pushing further this divide between how Europe regulates versus how the United States essentially does not regulate, and how the two governments see social media and regulation and businesses in general.
Um, the US and EU have been in a conflict over EU's digital laws for, I think, since Trump took over. And this is another significant story that continues to shape up because the Trump administration has pushed back not just against Europe, mainly Europe, but not just against Europe. They push back against any regulation worldwide that takes account of the way platforms work. So this is an ongoing issue. There have been various consistent efforts from the US administration to lobby also in favor of big tech companies. And every time the commission has come up with a fine, we've seen whether it's Trump or any higher officials in the US administration explicitly calling out, but they've also placed five individuals on visa sanctions, including the former EU Commissioner Thierry Breton, because he was involved with the passing of the Digital Services Act that we were talking about. So there've been a lot of efforts to try and ensure that Europe doesn't regulate and also the rest of the world doesn't regulate. So another tension that we are again going to see how this plays out and what the impact would be. But so far, I would say the lobbying from US front is working. In
Hmm.
terms, we're now seeing obviously Europe bureaucracy is also much slower in terms of how things move, and the law is also still very new. And it's only now we're coming up with back-to-back enforcement decisions under the DSA. But so far, it hasn't had as much impact as you think it would. And that's very interesting as well, that whether the DSA or Europe is able to change platforms and keep the same relationship with their ally US, that's a big question.
It's also a big question if they're still allies sometimes.
Yes,
Um,
of course.
But you know what, it also highlights a contradiction in the US approach. Because what we've seen in the case of TikTok is that US really trying to go after TikTok. Earlier we saw that, they spoke about the algorithm of TikTok and not being happy with it. And then there's essentially a hostile takeover of the US arm of the company. So on one hand, we see the US resenting the European Union and trying to regulate or hold accountable platforms that are based in the United States. But then we see the United States going after platforms that are based in China, like TikTok, and then, effectively changing the ownership of the company, and very publicly talking about changes to the algorithm. So, of course, as it would appear, it doesn't seem to be a consistent policy decision, but rather a politically motivated push, right, towards regulation, and that really stands out. maybe we can talk a bit about the fight for the feed, right? So you already talked about Meta's teen accounts and how Meta says that, we have made all these changes. So what are the problems with teen accounts? And you already touched upon this a little bit. But then maybe you can talk a bit about the rabbit hole investigation that the EU Commission has also done, and what that's telling us about these
Yeah,
companies.
so essentially what's happening when we frame risk mitigation, basically they're framing risk mitigation or intervention as user level safeguards and not system redesign, right? Like if you give someone an option to block an account or report an account or uh, tell a platform, I don't like to see this or don't show me content like this. Those are user level safeguards. What the law, the SA, and what the commission is trying to do is that they are going for system redesign because they're saying, for instance, as I mentioned with the team accounts, that they don't solve the problem in a meaningful way. Because kids can easily bypass and access accounts. Second, this is not just about one video or it's about having access to um, various ways. So one, if it's on Instagram, you can see it on Facebook, Messenger, there are multiple accounts. So this is just having this function is not enough. Also with time restrictions, as you will see, this is not just for children. We all have access to time restrictions on Instagram. If we've all done this, we've tried to limit our time on Instagram, but you can easily, once the phone prompts you that you've passed your time limit, you can easily ignore that and then go back and continue scrolling. So we've seen that time restrictions are also not effective. So those are like the key concerns. And the EU pushback is basically saying that these are very surface level and that recommended systems still optimize for engagement. And we need to shift from what is removed to how content is ranked and delivered in our approach to regulation. It's the same with the rabbit hole dynamics, where you have very there's a downward spiral. So for instance, you get so addicted and you are, as we say, down the rabbit hole. There's an endless amount of content out there, so you will continue scrolling and you will become more and more vulnerable to those harmful downward spirals. It also creates an incentive to continue viewing things because again, you are so into it, you will just want to see more and more of it. And then at the same time, as I was giving the example of cat videos, it gives very narrow content exposure. So if I'm into cat videos and I spend a longer time watching a cat video, I will receive more and more of cat videos and not more diverse content. So I will only, and this is very important for elections and politics, that you only see one viewpoint more and
Hmm.
more and not diverse viewpoints. So that's also the rabbit hole dynamics that the commission is separately investigating against Meta. And again, the problem is overall amplification and not just isolated harmful content.
Right, and we already talked about, you mentioned that TikTok is facing a similar accountability push from the European Union. And then what we've also seen is a lot of state legislation in the United States targeting TikTok as well. But what we also have is cases in courts about addiction of these platforms, right? So whereas the government may not be happy with it, courts in the US may be taking a different approach towards addiction, similar to what the European Commission is saying. So it's not like it's just in the EU that this is happening. This is clearly points to an issue that people are facing across the board in different regions. And, talking about age assurance and teen accounts, we've seen the UK, Australia, and other countries ban social media for teens, usually under the age of 16 years old. So that's also a push that we're seeing becoming more global because of the way these designs are done. So it would make sense for platforms to essentially address these issues before regulators and governments start coming for different aspects of it and instituting, bans, like we've seen for younger people. Um, so In summary, what Ramsha you're telling us is that putting individual level protections within the platform design is clearly not enough for the regulators in the European Union. And they're asking the companies to address the overall design of their algorithms, of their feeds, and how they're ranking things. And then also how um, they're being rolled out. So potentially we're looking at a huge change in how social media operates if the EU Commission's steps are to go through. But we've also seen in the past, over the years, how in so many cases the experience of social media in the European Union is very different from how you experience social media in the United States or in Asia or anywhere else in the world. So, for example, a lot of products. So, for example, Meta's Threads was launched everywhere
Yeah.
but the European Union, right? Meta Ray-Ban glasses, for example, are not available in the European Union, if I'm not wrong. And what we're also seeing is that, consenting to data being processed, there's higher threshold for that when you use or access social media in the European Union versus rest of the world. So what we could potentially be seeing in this is that changes being instituted in the European Union for users, but not the rest of the world. Is that a possibility that you see? And if so, how do you think that would impact how social media is experienced by anyone around the world?
I think there are changes that you can make country specific, and then there are changes that are just not possible because of the way platforms work. And the things we're talking about, like infinite scroll, the algorithm ranking based algorithms and advertising, those are things that are not possible to implement country specific. So which is why again the case is so significant globally, because if Meta or any platform were to make these changes in Europe, they would basically have to do this worldwide. Um,
Mm.
of course, you can introduce small changes like data protection laws are more strict in Europe. So, uh, you have the cookies and consent and data collection and those requirements. But this is what we're talking about, the way social media functions. And that's a much bigger thing than, specific controls. And this is another concern. And it's been the criticism of Europe's approach that because Europe is so tight on regulation, they're going to miss out on technological innovation and products. This is what criticism of and now Europe is also heading in a simplification direction where there have been efforts to simplify their laws in order to not miss out on innovation. But as far as online safety goes, which is what we're talking about today, and the DSA and the essence of that goes, I think it's going to be very interesting precedent-setting interventions. There are already. I mean, we've seen private litigation in US, like you were talking about, but elsewhere we haven't seen regulators going after design as much, at least
Mm.
yet. So this is a first in the world, and we will see how it plays out and whether it will have any impact. But I think it is for now a big moment in the online safety discussion. The fact that a regulator of this importance is going for design changes over content changes.
Thank you very much for joining us, Ramsha, and for explaining this so clearly. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Ramsha Jahangir from the Tech Policy Press joining us from the Netherlands and breaking down how the European Union is trying to regulate platforms. In specific, we discussed meta platforms on their addictive design. So, this is really a significant case. And we're all watching how it plays out and how the reaction to it is from different governments. But that's it from us today. Thank you very much for joining. This is your host, Usama Khilji, signing out, and we'll see you next week with another episode of DigiPod on DawnNews English.